Well, welcome back once again. We come to the seventh and the final rule that Owen lays down here in Duties of Christian Fellowship as it pertains to a congregant's duty to his or her pastor. So after this rule, we will transition into what I like to think is the real meat of the book, and that is our duties towards our Christian brothers and sisters. But here in the seventh rule that Owen lays down, this is the rule that he states here seventhly. He says that believers, along with their families, must gather together as a congregation before the pastor at the times appointed by him. So you can hear very simply there that what Owen concludes here with these duties is that congregants must gather, they must assemble together when the minister calls them forth to gather as a church. You do note in his context believers and their families as well, as this would be the duties of households to come and to gather. Now the proof text that Owen gives for this comes from Acts chapter 14 verse 27, where we read, "And when they arrived and gathered the church together," speaking of the apostles as they were going and they were gathering the church together, presumably for public worship. So Owen draws this final duty from that verse, that it is necessary that families gather when the minister calls them forth to gather. Now, the interesting thing here about Owen's seventh rule is that as he has walked through the first six, we've noted a similar pattern, that he states the rule and he gives some proof texts, and then he gives an explanation of why this rule is what it is from the scriptures. And then most of the time he'll also offer some motives to encourage us in being faithful to the duties that he has laid down. The peculiar thing about Rule 7 here is that Owen says nothing about this after the proof text. That is, that he doesn't unravel it for us, he doesn't explain it, and he doesn't give us any motives for keeping this rule. Now, that may be because Owen was living within a historical context where this was just a given, where when the minister called people forth to gather as a church, the people just listened, and Owen may have been taking that for granted. It may be that he didn't want to explain it, or he thought that the proof text was sufficient in and of itself. We don't know exactly why, at least I don't, why Owen left off an explanation of the motives for following this. But it is, and it does confront us with a very practical question and issue that I would like to deal with on the basis of Owen's rule here, of this seventh duty that he gives. And that is to really ask, in our contemporary and individualistic anti-authoritarian society, is it right and wise and biblical to say that it is left to the individual conscience to determine if and when they ought to be gathering together as a church? Right? Now, this question is assuming membership within the church. We're not going to deal with that issue, as there are many people who profess to be Christians and yet they're not members. But dealing with members of a church, members who have committed themselves to the church, is it wise and biblical that they can determine by their individual conscience whether or not they are going to gather primarily as a church and when the church is called together? I think as we look at this, we can just give a very basic example. Let's say that Saturday night, a couple has John and Jane Doe. They've gone out and they stayed up way past their bedtime, going out to eat and watching a movie. And when their alarm goes off on Sunday morning, they are just super tired. And they think, I'm just going to use this as a sleep-in day. We're not going to go and gather for worship, but rather we're going to make use of this time to get refreshed and rested so that when we hit the ground running with our work week, we'll be able to have maximum productivity and output. Is it left to the individual to determine whether or not it's acceptable to attend church when the church is gathering? And I think a biblical answer and a confessional answer would tell us that ordinarily the answer is no. That individuals don't retain the liberty to determine for themselves, is it okay or not okay to skip gathering together as a church? Now, I know that to many people that can sound relatively authoritarian, that can feel like an encroachment upon my individuality and my liberty. But I want to walk you through just a couple points of why I think biblically and certainly confessionally the answer to that is ordinarily no. I think it is helpful that as we answer this, that we consider the following points. And the first point to consider carefully is that we ought to first rightly distinguish between public worship and other activities within the church. We live in a day and age where the church doesn't only gather for morning and or evening worship, but when many churches gather on Wednesday nights, when many churches have weekly Bible studies, when many churches have prayer meetings, when they have fellowship meals, right? We have a lot of times where the church comes together as brothers and sisters. And from a biblical perspective, I think it's helpful to distinguish between these two. Between that of public worship, where we gather to hear the preaching and the reading of God's Word, and where we respond to Him in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, where we enter into public prayer one with another, and to distinguish that from all the other activities that often accompany the church. And so in asking this question, do individuals, are they left to just the freedom of their own decision about whether or not today is a good day to attend these things? Well, in distinguishing between public worship and all these other activities, when it comes to public worship, I think we need to bear in mind that the reason why the answer is no is because when we gather for public worship, we are gathering because God, by His Word and Spirit, is calling His people forth to worship Him on His holy day. Now, within our church here at Providence, right, we show this truth as we give a call to worship before every public worship service. All right, something along the lines of, I'll open the Bible and I'll say, on this day we're called forth to declare the praises of God as He calls us forth by this verse. And then I typically read something from the Psalms about gathering together, about worshiping the Lord, rejoicing in His name, gathering together as His covenant people, something along those lines. When we have public worship, and this is where I might have a little scruple with Owen, it's not so much the pastor that is inviting people to come to worship, but it is God the Father who is seeking worshipers to worship Him in spirit and in truth. And so when it comes to public worship, when God summons His people to come and present themselves before Him and to worship, our only response ought to be faithful obedience to His calling and to His gathering us together. So ordinarily when it comes to public worship, if God is the one calling us, then we ought to be responding with yes. And if we remember this principle with public worship, then if you go back and you look at the example of John and Jane Doe, who just decided that they were too tired and decided that they needed to be rested for Monday morning, all right, what is it that they are rejecting as they decide to remain in bed? Well, they are rejecting the gracious call of our covenant God who invites us to this glorious privilege of worshiping Him publicly with our brothers and our sisters. Now, in light of this, we also need to draw another distinction, particularly as it deals with public worship. In Reformed theology, we often distinguish between elements of worship and circumstances of worship. And elements of worship is the way in which we worship God. And when we speak of elements of worship, we say that these things are non-negotiable, that the Bible has laid these things down, and if we are going to be faithful to the Scriptures, then we must worship God as God desires to be worshipped. And so in our church, right, the elements of worship include things like the greetings and the benediction that God gives to his people by his word and spirit. This includes the singing of psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. This includes the reading and the preaching and the conscious hearing of God's word. This includes the offerings. These are all elements of worship. And when it comes to elements of worship, as a pastor and as an elder, it's my duty to be faithful to those things, right? To present those in such a way that God's people can be faithful to how God desires to be worshipped. So those are the elements of worship, the non-negotiable. It deals with the way and how is it that we worship God. But when it comes to circumstances, we say that circumstances are different than elements. Elements are essential, and circumstances, in some regards, are very non-essential. And circumstances really deal with, well, when do we gather for public worship? And how often do we gather together for public worship? All right, we should realize that you're going to search the Scriptures in vain to find the Bible saying, well, when you meet for public worship, you got to do it at 11 a.m. in the morning. Similarly, you're not going to find an explicit Bible verse that tells you that you ought to be gathering on the Lord's Day, both for an a.m. service and for a p.m. service. All right, that's not in the Scriptures. There's things that allude to that, like the Old Testament sacrifices offered in the morning and in the evening. All right, the psalm that declares from the rising of the sun even to the setting of it, your name is to be praised. The many examples that we have in the New Testament of public worship, often when the time of day is noted, it is evening worship. You think of the way in which Christ gathered with his disciples after his resurrection. It was in the night of the first day of the week. And when Paul went to preach to the people in Ephesus in Acts 20, that we are told that it was nighttime worship, right? So I like to, maybe this is a little cheeky, but sometimes I like to say that there's more biblical precedence for evening worship than there is for morning worship. But you'll search the Scriptures in vain for them to say, well, look, the church has to meet both morning and evening. We would say that when the church gathers, the time, and how often the church gathers, that this is a circumstance of worship. But circumstances of worship, as they come in the church, are ordinarily determined and decided by the elders of the church. So when it comes to the time of our services, when I first came to this Providence 6.5 years ago, we met for morning worship at 11 a.m. And the session made the decision that we were going to move that worship back and begin at 10:30 a.m. All right, that was a decision that the session made. The session is the one who has made the decision that in our Lord's Supper that we offer grape juice and wine, and that our grape juice is actually white grape juice as opposed to the red wine, so that we can distinguish these things. These things are circumstances of worship, and circumstances ordinarily are left to the decision of the elders, as they are the leaders and those who are in authority over the church. And so when the session determines these circumstances of when we are going to worship and how often we're going to gather for public worship on the Lord's Day, I think it is prudent of members that as they submit to their elders and as they submit to the decisions that they have made, that congregants make the best effort that they can to attend public worship. Our own Westminster Confession of Faith, largely parroting the language of Hebrews chapter 10, verse 25, notes that we should not willfully neglect the gathering together of the church. Right? This comes from Hebrews, as I noted, chapter 10, verse 25, where the preacher of Hebrews says, "Do not neglect gathering together as some are in the habit of doing." And so the ordinary idea here with public worship is that when God calls, his people ought to respond by gathering for worship. And that though there are some circumstances that pertain to this, that circumstances as it pertains to public worship is largely left to the wisdom and the discretion of the elders and those who are leaders and authorities. Now, in saying all of that, we ought to clarify that there are times when individuals are providentially hindered from gathering together in the church, and that's understandable. Somebody's health condition may require that they not be able to gather. Somebody's issues with perhaps children might be providentially hindering them. If you're away on a business trip or vacation, you may not be able to gather at your local church where you have membership. We understand that there are times when people are providentially hindered. But from a biblical and confessional perspective, we should see that those are the extraordinary circumstances that ordinarily congregants have a duty of attending very diligently and faithfully upon the means of grace as they are administered in public worship. So at least in this way, we can see that Owen's principle here, his rule, right, that believers along with their families must gather together as a congregation before the pastor at the times appointed by him. Right, in keeping with Acts 14 and the apostles and the ministers gathering the people together, the elders of this church have a responsibility to gather people together, to give the call of God. And though it is circumstantial as to what time we're going to meet and how often we're going to meet, that it is a duty for individuals to participate and to gather for that. Now, when it comes to other activities, remember, we have public worship, it's done on the Lord's Day, and all these other activities. The question could be asked here, do people have and members have a responsibility of gathering together for those things as well? When the church gathers for Sunday school lessons, for Bible studies, for prayer meetings, for fellowship ministries, or fellowship meals, right? Are these services, these extra things, do they require the attendance of members? All right, well, here at our church, we very explicitly during these times draw a distinction between these activities and public worship. And so we say things like Sunday schools and Bible studies, that these things are not binding by the Word or by the Spirit. And so there is some flexibility when it comes to attending upon these things. And the second consideration that I want to take with you is not only drawing this distinction between public worship and other activities, but to then just ask, well, should members then participate in all services, whether it's public worship or other activities? How can we tackle that and understand that? Well, as I've already noted with you, that when it comes to public worship, absolutely. Unless one is providentially hindered, and only in extraordinary situations should people not gather for public worship on the Lord's days. So in dealing with public worship, we say yes. But in dealing with all these other programs, I think it's important for elders and pastors to bear in mind, right, that the fourth commandment has given us not only a day of rest, but has also given us 6 days by which we are to work. Now, I have been in churches before, and there's still many churches around today, where church activities outside of the context of public worship, that though these things may be beneficial, that they have many of these things, and that people could take up every night of their week, and potentially even times during the day, to attend all of these activities. There are many churches that are very program-driven, that expect large attendance in these, if we will, extracurricular activities. And it's important that elders and ministers remember that not only has the Lord set one day apart for worship, but that he has set 6 days apart for man to labor and to do all of his work. And labor and work can be intense enough and can be demanding enough that if churches continue to proliferate all of these programs and extracurricular activities, rather than the church being the fountain of living water and rejuvenation and refreshment, the church can become burdensome. It can become a labor. It can become just another priority and another commitment that is heaped upon us. And so I think we need to, as elders, we need to ensure that when we have these other activities, that we do schedule them rightly, that we don't overly burden individuals with the other activities in the church. Now that's one thing pastors should keep in mind. But as it pertains to congregants, because this isn't public worship, you have a free check and a free license not to attend these things as you desire. I would encourage you, at least those of you who are members of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church and of Providence, to remember what you have promised in becoming a member of this church. That as you were received, we asked you a series of 5 questions. And that the last question asks, do you promise to participate faithfully in this church's worship and service, and to submit in the Lord to its government? It's a question of submission. It's a question of commitment. Are you committed to attending not only upon the worship of the church, but also in the service of the church, and in those programs that the elders have determined are beneficial and offer a service to the church? And I think that members ought to ask themselves that if they are finding themselves at odds with the service of the church, so that they are habitually absented even from these other activities, maybe they need to reflect and ask, why did I make this promise? And did I really mean that I would participate faithfully in this church's worship and service? And if one finds that they are continually at odds with the service of the church and the different opportunities that hopefully aren't overly laborious on a person's weekly schedules, if they continue to find themselves at odds, I think it's right to ask, am I really even committed to this church? Am I really fulfilling what I've promised in my 5th membership vow? Again, even here we understand that sometimes providentially people will be hindered, that maybe they work late so they can't attend these things. All right, but is there a case here to be made, again, for ordinary and extraordinary? Ordinarily, ought people to be committed even to these other activities as they have made this promise to participate faithfully in the worship in the service of the church? I don't personally think that it's too much to ask, and that it is a wonderful way in which the church gathers together. So Owen here, in his 7th and his final rule, he states that believers, along with their families, must gather together as a congregation before the pastor at the times appointed by him. And though he doesn't give an explanation of this, our explanation is to distinguish between public worship, which is almost always a non-negotiable, and all of these other activities. When it comes to public worship, yes, this rule holds true, that ordinarily, when God calls us to worship him by his word and spirit through the ministry of the minister, it is the duty of congregants to respond to that gracious seeking of our Heavenly Father. And when it comes to those other activities, though we might not be biblically bound to attend these on a regular basis, we ought to ask, what is that 5th membership vow that we have made to participate faithfully, not only in the worship of this church, but also in the service of this church? So here it is, the 7th rule, and this is the final rule that Owen closes with. As he closes off this section, John Owen writes for us, "These are some of the areas where the church has a duty towards him," that is the pastor, "or them who are set over them in the Lord, encouraging them in their work in every way possible, saying to them also, See that you fulfill the ministry that you have received from the Lord. Whatever might be appropriate also to church officers other than the pastor may be understood from these 7 rules. So here are the first 7 rules. So we have the opportunity for our next film, or our next recording. We'll come to consider those duties that are required of Christians in fellowship with their brothers and their sisters. I hope this has been profitable to you. And again, if you have any questions or comments, don't hesitate to email me at opcprovidence@gmail.com. Thanks for tuning in.